The night she knocked on Elias Turner's door, the wind was cold enough to make a man question every promise he had ever made to himself. Snow swept across the Wyoming prairie in long white sheets, swallowing fence posts, wagon tracks, and anything foolish enough to remain outside after sundown. Elias sat alone beside a small iron stove, listening to the familiar sounds of winter pressing against the walls of his cabin. For 12 years, no visitor had crossed his threshold after dark. For 12 years, that had suited him just fine. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not desperate, just enough to make him lift his head. Elias frowned and stared toward the door. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town, strangers rarely appeared by accident. He reached for the lantern hanging beside the table and stood. The knocking came again, this time weaker, the kind of sound made by someone running out of strength. The cabin floor creaked beneath his boots as he crossed the room. Wind whistled through the cracks around the doorframe. Snow rattled against the windows. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Winter had a way of creating problems that belonged to other people. But something about those knocks lingered in the silence. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. The storm immediately pushed inside. Freezing air swept through the cabin. Snowflakes spun around the lantern light. And there, kneeling in the drifts outside, was a woman. She looked no older than 30. Her dark hair was dusted white with snow. Her shoulders trembled beneath a worn blanket that offered little protection against the cold. Around her neck hung a turquoise necklace, its blue stone glowing softly beneath the lantern light. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were exhausted, frightened, yet strangely determined. She looked up at him through the storm and swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered. Her voice barely carried above the wind. "Don't leave me to freeze." Elias said nothing. He noticed immediately that she was Apache. Most men in the territory would have shut the door without a second thought. Some might have done worse. But she did not look dangerous. She looked tired. The woman lowered her gaze for a moment as if searching for the right words. Then she spoke again. "If you let me stay, I'll give you a warm bed every night." The sentence landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Elias blinked. For a second, he wondered if he had heard her correctly. The woman seemed equally surprised by his expression. She looked confused, almost embarrassed, though not for the reason he expected. The wind howled across the prairie. Snow gathered around her knees. Neither moved. Then Elias noticed something else. She was clutching the turquoise necklace tightly enough that her knuckles had turned pale. Not like jewelry. Like something precious. Something worth protecting. And as the lantern light flickered across the storm, he caught sight of distant shapes moving along a ridge nearly half a mile away. Horsemen, watching the cabin through the falling snow. The horsemen disappeared behind a curtain of snow before Elias could count them. For a long moment he stood in the doorway, lantern held high, watching the ridge where the shadows had been. Nothing remained except wind and darkness. When he finally looked back down, the woman swayed where she knelt. The stubborn determination that had carried her this far was fading fast. Elias sighed and stepped aside. "Get inside before the storm makes the decision for both of us." Relief flashed across her face. Not joy, not victory, just relief. She rose unsteadily and crossed the threshold. The moment the door closed behind her, the cabin felt smaller, warmer, different. Snow melted from her blanket and formed small puddles on the wooden floor. Elias hung the lantern near the stove and tossed another log into the fire. Orange light filled the room. The woman remained near the door as if uncertain she belonged there. Her eyes moved across the cabin, taking in every detail. The iron stove, the rough pine table, the saddle hanging on the wall, the silence. "You can sit," Elias said. She hesitated before lowering herself onto a chair. Her hands never left the turquoise necklace. Elias noticed it again. The stone was old, older than anything usually traded through the territory. Tiny markings circled its silver frame. He could not read them, but he knew enough about frontier life to recognize something valuable when he saw it. "What is your name?" he asked. The woman studied him carefully before answering. "Aiyana." Elias nodded once. "Elias Turner." Another silence settled between them. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the storm continued to push against the cabin walls. Aiyana extended her hands toward the heat. Her fingers trembled from the cold. Elias filled a tin cup with hot coffee and placed it on the table beside her. She looked surprised, then grateful. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. He sat across from her. Those men on the ridge. Were they looking for you? The warmth seemed to leave her face. Her eyes dropped to the cup. Maybe. Maybe is not much of an answer. She remained silent. Elias had spent most of his life around cattle. He knew when something was being driven too hard. Pushing now would get him nowhere. Aiyana wrapped both hands around the steaming cup. The scent of coffee filled the air. After several moments, she spoke quietly. If they find me, they will take something that does not belong to them. Her fingers tightened around the necklace. That? Elias asked. She glanced down at the turquoise stone. Yes. He waited for more. None came. Whatever story followed those words was buried deep. The firelight danced across the silver frame of the necklace. For the first time, Elias noticed a small crack running through the stone. It looked as though it had survived a long journey. Perhaps many journeys. A sudden sound interrupted the silence. A horse somewhere outside. Then another. Very faint, barely audible beneath the wind. Aiyana heard it too. Her shoulders stiffened instantly. The cup stopped halfway to her lips. Neither spoke. They simply listened. The sounds vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Yet the fear in Aiyana's eyes remained. And in that moment Elias realized something unsettling. Whatever danger was following her had not been left behind in the storm. Morning arrived slowly, hidden behind thick gray clouds that turned the world beyond the cabin windows into a blur of drifting white. Elias woke before sunrise as he always did. Years of ranch life had trained his body better than any clock. For a moment, he sat quietly on the edge of his bed, listening. The storm had weakened. The wind still moved across the prairie, but no longer with the fury of the night before. Somewhere inside the cabin, he heard the soft crackle of firewood. That made him pause. He had not left the stove burning. Elias stepped into the main room and stopped. Aiyana was kneeling beside the iron stove. Fresh logs had been stacked neatly nearby. The fire burned bright and steady. A pot of water warmed above the flames. Sunlight from the cloudy morning touched the silver edges of the turquoise necklace resting against her coat. She glanced up as he entered. You were cold, she said simply. Elias looked at the stove, then back at her. Most guests sleep late. Most guests are not trying to earn their place. The answer lingered in the room. She returned her attention to the fire. Elias found himself strangely unsure what to say. For years he had lived alone. No one touched anything in this cabin except him. No one moved his tools. No one fed his horses. No one added wood to his stove before dawn. Yet somehow her presence did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like a memory of something he had forgotten. Later that morning they stepped outside. The storm had left nearly 2 feet of snow across the ranch. Fence posts rose from the drifts like lonely markers in a white ocean. Elias walked toward the barn. Aiyana followed several steps behind. The horses greeted them with impatient snorts. She watched as Elias carried hay across the frozen ground. Without a word, she picked up a second bundle. You do not have to do that, he said. I know. She kept walking. By midday, the clouds finally began to break. Thin beams of sunlight spilled across the valley. The world sparkled beneath fresh snow. For the first time since arriving, Aiyana seemed less afraid. She stood beside the corral watching the distant mountains. Beautiful, she whispered. Elias followed her gaze. Most people call it empty. A small smile touched her face. Empty and beautiful are not the same thing. The words reminded him of someone, though he could not remember who. As afternoon settled over the ranch, Elias climbed onto the porch carrying a bucket of water. Then he noticed tracks. Not old tracks buried by the storm. Fresh ones. Horse tracks. 3 sets. They approached from the northern ridge and stopped beyond the nearest line of cottonwood trees. Elias slowly set down the bucket. The tracks did not continue toward the cabin. Whoever had been there had chosen to watch from a distance. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Aiyana stepped outside. One look at his expression was enough. They found me, she said quietly. Elias looked toward the trees again. The snow-covered valley seemed peaceful, silent. But peace and safety were not always the same thing. And for the first time, he began to suspect that the woman he had rescued from the storm was carrying far more than a necklace. Aiyana did not take her eyes off the distant tree line. The late afternoon sun rested low above the snowy hills, turning the valley gold and silver. Everything looked peaceful. That was what troubled Elias most. Real danger rarely announced itself. It waited. It watched. He bent down beside the tracks and studied them carefully. 3 horses. Fresh. No more than an hour old. Whoever had come this far knew exactly where they were going. When he straightened, Aiyana was already clutching the turquoise necklace again. The habit seemed unconscious now, as natural as breathing. "Who are they?" Elias asked. For a moment she remained silent. Snow drifted from the barn roof in soft sheets. A horse shifted inside its stall. Somewhere overhead a hawk circled against the pale winter sky. Finally she answered. "Men who want something they believe belongs to them." "And does it?" Her fingers tightened around the silver chain. No, Elias studied her face. He had seen fear before. What he saw now was different. Determination. The look of someone carrying a burden too important to abandon. Together they walked back toward the cabin. The warmth inside felt welcome after the cold air. Elias hung his coat near the stove while Aiyana remained standing beside the table. The necklace rested against her chest. Firelight reflected from the turquoise stone. "You keep holding that thing like your life depends on it," Elias said. "Maybe it does." The answer was quiet. Honest. Elias pulled out a chair and sat down. "Then tell me why." Aiyana lowered herself into the chair across from him. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a low whisper. She carefully removed the necklace and placed it on the table. For the first time since arriving, she let it leave her hands. Elias leaned forward. Up close, the stone appeared older than he had realized. Tiny symbols circled the silver frame. Years of wear had softened the edges. Aiyana touched the necklace gently. "This belonged to my grandfather." Elias waited. He was trusted by many people, Apache and white settlers alike. He believed promises mattered more than power. A faint smile crossed her face before fading. Not everyone agreed. "What is inside it?" Elias asked. Aiyana looked surprised. "You know there is something inside?" "The silver frame is too thick." For the first time, she almost laughed. "You notice more than most men." Carefully, she turned the necklace over and pressed a hidden catch. A tiny compartment opened beneath the stone. Elias expected gold, perhaps a map. Instead, he found folded paper. Old paper, protected for years. Aiyana unfolded it with extraordinary care. Names covered the page. Dates. Signatures. Elias frowned. He did not recognize most of them. Then his eyes stopped on one name near the bottom. The air seemed to leave the room. He stared at the ink, stared at the familiar handwriting. Because among the signatures, written decades earlier, was a name he knew better than his own. Samuel Turner. His father. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The fire continued its steady crackling, but the cabin suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Elias stared at the signature on the paper. Samuel Turner. The letters were faded with age, yet unmistakable. He had seen that handwriting his entire childhood on feed orders, ranch records, and birthday notes left beside his bed before dawn. His father had been gone for nearly 15 years, but seeing the name now felt like hearing his voice from another room. "Where did you get this?" Elias finally asked. Aiyana carefully folded the paper and laid it beside the necklace. "My grandfather kept it hidden." Her eyes remained fixed on the document. "He said there would come a day when people needed to remember what was promised." Elias leaned back slowly. "Promised by whom?" Aiyana nodded toward the signatures. "Settlers, ranchers, tribal elders. They met many winters ago." She hesitated before continuing. "They agreed that certain lands would remain shared. Water, grazing routes, places where families from both sides depended on each other." Elias listened quietly. The story felt older than the territory itself. "Then why hide it?" Aiyana's expression darkened. "Because some people became wealthy when those promises were forgotten." Outside, wind brushed against the cabin walls. Somewhere in the barn a horse stomped its hoof. The ordinary sounds only made the conversation feel more extraordinary. Elias looked again at his father's name. He remembered Samuel Turner as a practical man. Honest. Stubborn. The kind of rancher who shook hands only when he intended to keep his word. "My father never mentioned any of this. My grandfather said many good people stayed silent because they believed the truth would survive without them." A faint sadness entered her voice. "Sometimes truth needs help." The words settled heavily between them. Elias stood and walked to the window. The valley stretched beyond the glass, covered in snow and fading daylight. He had spent most of his life believing his ranch existed apart from history. A lonely patch of land surrounded by more lonely patches of land. Now he was beginning to understand that long before he was born, lives had crossed here in ways he never imagined. Behind him, Aiyana carefully returned the paper to the hidden compartment inside the necklace. Her movements were precise, almost ceremonial. "The men following you," Elias said without turning around. "Do they want the document?" "Yes." "Why not make a copy?" Aiyana lowered her eyes. "Because people trust paper less than they trust stories. And stories less than they trust power." Elias almost smiled at the truth of that. Evening shadows stretched across the snow outside. The last sunlight disappeared behind distant hills. Then Aiyana spoke again. "There is something else." Elias turned back toward her. The seriousness in her face immediately caught his attention. She rested one hand on the necklace. "My grandfather told me one more name before he died." Elias waited. "He said if I was ever lost, if I ever carried this alone, I should find Samuel Turner's family." Aiyana looked directly into his eyes. "He believed your father would have protected this document." The fire popped softly. Neither moved. Because for the first time since she arrived, Elias realized her journey to his ranch might never have been an accident at all. That night neither of them slept much. The discovery of the document had changed something inside the cabin. The storm outside had passed, yet a different kind of weather now lingered between them. Questions filled the silence. Elias sat at the table long after midnight, turning memories over in his mind like stones in a river. He remembered his father speaking about honor, about promises, about the kind of man who could look another person in the eye without lowering his gaze. At the time those lessons had seemed ordinary. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed. When dawn finally arrived, pale sunlight spilled across the snowy valley. Aiyana was already awake. Elias found her standing near the window, watching the horizon. The turquoise necklace rested in her hands. "You always wake before sunrise?" he asked. She nodded. "My grandfather used to say important things travel with the morning light." Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Did he always speak in riddles?" A faint smile appeared. "Only when he wanted people to remember." They stepped outside together. The air was cold enough to sting their lungs, but the sky had cleared. Fresh snow stretched for miles beneath a bright blue horizon. For the first time since arriving, Aiyana seemed at peace. She stood quietly beside the fence while sunlight touched the valley. "This place feels familiar," she said. "You have never been here." "No." She looked toward the distant hills. "But my grandfather described it." Elias followed her gaze. "What did he say?" Aiyana thought for a moment. "He said there was a ranch where the mountains watched over honest people." Elias laughed softly. "He must have had the wrong ranch." "I do not think so." The answer came without hesitation. Something about the certainty in her voice unsettled him. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt true. As the day passed, they worked side by side. Elias repaired a section of fence buried by snow while Aiyana helped clear the path leading to the barn. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. The quiet between them had begun to feel comfortable, familiar. Yet beneath that growing trust, something else waited. Near sunset, Aiyana entered the cabin carrying a bundle of firewood. She placed it beside the stove and paused. "There is something I should tell you." Elias looked up. The seriousness in her expression immediately caught his attention. "What is it?" She hesitated. "The night I arrived, when I asked you not to leave me outside." Her cheeks reddened slightly. "The words I used were wrong." Elias remembered them instantly. The awkwardness that had followed. The confusion. "I noticed." Aiyana lowered her eyes. "In my grandfather's language, offering someone a warm bed means promising to keep their home warm, to tend the fire, to care for the household that saved you." Elias stared at her for a moment. Then he began to laugh. Not loudly, just enough to surprise both of them. Aiyana covered her face, embarrassed. "You thought something else." "I absolutely did." For the first time since arriving, she laughed too. The sound filled the cabin like sunlight breaking through clouds. Yet neither of them noticed the rider watching from a distant ridge outside, or the fact that he had already turned his horse toward town. 3 days later, the valley no longer felt isolated. Word traveled quickly across the frontier, especially when fear carried it. Elias noticed the change the moment he rode into town for supplies. Conversations stopped when he entered the general store. People who normally nodded in greetings suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. Even the old men gathered near the stove seemed unusually interested in their coffee cups. The silence followed him like a shadow. When he reached the counter, the store owner avoided his eyes. "Something on your mind, Walter?" Elias asked. Walter hesitated. "You should send her away." Elias did not need to ask who he meant. "That is not your concern. It will become everyone's concern soon enough." The words lingered long after Elias left the store. Outside, the winter sun hung low over the rooftops. Snow reflected bright light across the street. Yet beneath the calm surface of town life, something had shifted. Rumors had arrived before facts. By the time Elias returned to the ranch that evening, he found Aiyana standing beside the corral. She immediately recognized the look on his face. "They know." It was not a question. Elias nodded. "Looks that way." Aiyana stared toward the distant mountains. "My grandfather always said fear runs faster than horses." Neither spoke for a while. The cold air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "You could stay hidden here until spring." Aiyana shook her head. "No, why not?" "Because hiding only teaches fear that it is stronger than truth." Elias frowned. "You sound like your grandfather again." "That is because he was usually right." The following morning proved how right he had been. Shortly after sunrise, riders appeared on the road leading toward the ranch. Not 3, not 5, more than 20 men from nearby settlements and ranches. They stopped several hundred feet from the cabin. No one crossed the fence line. No one shouted. Yet their presence carried a message all the same. Elias watched from the porch while Aiyana stood quietly beside the doorway. The riders remained for nearly an hour before turning their horses and leaving. The silence they left behind felt heavier than any threat. That evening, Aiyana sat alone near the stove. The turquoise necklace rested in her lap. Firelight danced across the silver frame. Elias noticed she seemed distant. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "The easiest solution." Elias already knew what that meant. "No, you have not heard it yet." "I do not need to." Aiyana looked into the fire. "If I leave tonight, they stop looking at your ranch. They stop whispering your name. They stop treating you like an enemy." Elias walked over and sat across from her. "And what happens to you?" She did not answer. The silence was answer enough. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. Wind brushed gently against the cabin walls. Finally, Elias leaned forward. "My father signed that document." Aiyana looked up. "Yes." "Then this stopped being only your problem a long time ago." The fire crackled softly between them. Neither noticed the distant lantern lights moving along the northern ridge. More riders than before, and they were heading toward town. The next morning began with an uneasy calm. Frost covered the fence rails. Thin ribbons of smoke rose from chimneys far across the valley. Yet the stillness felt artificial, as though the land itself were waiting for something. Elias saddled his horse before sunrise. Aiyana stepped out onto the porch wrapped in her winter coat, the turquoise necklace hidden safely beneath the fabric. "Where are you going?" she asked. Elias tightened a saddle strap. "Town." Aiyana immediately understood. "You think the riders gathered there?" "I know they did." The memory of the lantern lights moving along the ridge remained fresh in his mind. Too many men. Too much secrecy. She walked closer. "Then I should come." Elias shook his head. "Not this time." Aiyana looked ready to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. After a moment, she nodded. "Be careful." The words followed him long after he rode away. By mid-morning, he reached town. What he found there surprised him. The streets were crowded despite the cold. Ranchers, merchants, farmers, and townsfolk filled every corner. Groups stood talking in low voices. Others gathered outside the courthouse. The atmosphere felt less like a market day and more like a community waiting for a verdict. Elias tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. Walter stood behind the counter. For once he looked relieved to see him. "You came." Elias frowned. "Seems everyone else did too." Walter glanced toward the courthouse window. Because someone finally started asking questions. That was not the answer Elias expected. "What questions?" Walter lowered his voice. "About land records, water rights, old agreements." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Within minutes, he learned the rest. During the previous week, copies of forgotten county records had appeared. Survey maps, letters, meeting notes, documents connected to agreements made decades earlier. Documents that matched details from the paper hidden inside Aiyana's necklace. People had begun comparing records, comparing signatures, comparing dates. And the more they compared, the more uncomfortable certain influential men became. Who released them? Elias asked. Walter smiled faintly. That is the interesting part. Nobody knows. By afternoon, the courthouse steps were packed. Lawyers arrived from neighboring counties. Reporters from distant towns appeared carrying notebooks. Conversations spread through the crowd like wildfire across dry grass. For years, rumors had controlled the story. Now facts were beginning to compete. Elias stood at the edge of the gathering, listening. Nobody spoke about Aiyana directly anymore. They spoke about documents, evidence, promises, history. Truth was slowly changing the shape of the conversation. As the sun began to sink, an elderly man approached him. His face was weathered by decades of frontier life. You are Samuel Turner's boy, aren't you? Elias nodded cautiously. The old man smiled. Your father tried to keep those agreements alive. Most people forgot that. He removed his hat respectfully. Some of us did not. Then he walked away before Elias could respond. Hours later, as Elias rode home beneath a sky filled with stars, he realized something important. For the first time since Aiyana had arrived, the fight was no longer hers alone. The truth had finally stepped into the open. And once truth begins walking, it is much harder to stop than a single frightened woman crossing a snowstorm. Winter surrendered slowly. Week by week, the snow retreated from the valley, revealing brown grass, winding streams, and the familiar shape of the land beneath. By early spring, the courthouse hearings had ended. Records had been verified. Old agreements had been acknowledged. The forgotten promises carried inside the turquoise necklace were no longer hidden. They belonged to history again. The men who had spent years benefiting from confusion found themselves facing questions they could no longer avoid. No dramatic showdown ever came. No crowd gathered demanding revenge. Instead, something far rarer happened. People listened. Farmers studied maps. Ranchers reread old records. Families discovered that the stories passed down by grandparents had contained more truth than rumor. In the end, the valley changed not because someone won, but because enough people finally chose to understand. One afternoon, Elias rode into town and noticed something that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. A group of settlers and Apache elders stood together outside the general store, discussing irrigation routes and grazing schedules. No one raised their voice. No one looked afraid. The sight stayed with him all the way home. When he reached the ranch, he found the cabin exactly as he had left it. Quiet, familiar, yet not lonely. For a while, Aiyana remained there, helping with repairs, tending the garden that emerged beside the cabin, and keeping her promise to care for the home that had sheltered her. Then one morning she told him she needed to leave. For how long? Elias asked. Aiyana smiled. Long enough to finish what my grandfather started. Elias nodded. He understood. Some journeys had to be completed before new ones could begin. She left at sunrise. The turquoise necklace rested against her chest as she rode away across the prairie. The valley felt larger after she disappeared beyond the hills. And strangely quieter. Weeks passed. Then months. Spring deepened into summer. Wildflowers covered the meadows. The rivers ran clear beneath bright skies. Life settled into its old rhythms. Yet Elias often found himself glancing toward the road without realizing it. One evening, nearly 4 months after her departure, he sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The air smelled of pine and warm earth. A horse appeared on the distant trail. At first it was only a moving shadow, then a rider, then a familiar figure. Elias stood slowly. Aiyana guided her horse through the gate and dismounted beside the porch. Neither spoke immediately. Some silences were too important to rush. Finally, she held out a folded blanket. It was hand-woven, patterned with turquoise and silver threads that caught the fading sunlight. For the cabin, she said. Elias accepted it carefully. That is a long ride just to deliver a blanket. Aiyana looked toward the open door behind him. Warm light spilled from the windows. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Home. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe I came to see if there is still room for someone who knows how to keep the fire going. Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside and left the door open. Aiyana smiled and walked inside. Beyond them, the last light of day settled across the valley. The mountains stood silent. The wind moved gently through the grass. And somewhere in that quiet, 2 old promises finally found a place to rest.